Well, hello, dear listeners and dear viewers. Welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the unseen process of recruiting and learn what happens after you click submit. Today, we have a special guest, but first, I'd like to introduce you to my co host, Greg Edlin. Greg, hi.
Hey, Michelle, how are you again?
I'm
Nice to
doing really
always join
well.
you.
Yes,
Thank you
yes,
for.
it's always great to be here.
I brought. I'll introduce my best friend Brian, who works
Yeah,
alongside me. Uh, so today, I figured it was a good idea to bring Brian along into our segment, since Brian can speak with some experience from the corporate recruiting side, because he's been talent acquisition for companies and transitioned over to the agency side. So
perfect, perfect. So thank you for giving us a sneak preview into what we're going to be talking about today, Greg. And that
my
is,
pleasure.
yes, agency and corporate recruiting. An important differentiation to talk about. We're going to talk about what happens behind the scenes, right? After you, dear applicant, click submit. Let's get straight to it. Brian, tell us about your background a little bit. Tell us a little bit about your.
So I've gone back and forth a little bit between agency and corporate recruiting. I got my start as a corporate recruiter. I worked for an insurance company. I worked for a national retailer, and I worked for an agency. I'm actually in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is kind of a neat, fun fact about me too. But I worked for
That's a cheesy fact.
No pun intended.
I worked for an agency in Milwaukee, and I've worked for a couple other corporate roles as well. So if you check out my LinkedIn profile, you can see everywhere that I've been, and it's kind of been a fun journey. I think though what it does for me as an agency recruiter is it just makes me very well rounded, because I understand both sides of the recruiting business, and I think that
Right.
makes me a pretty strong recruiter. So.
Excellent. Well, welcome. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the differences, agency versus corporate. Greg, why don't you take it first?
Sure. So today's segment, I think I'm going to cover the agency side and discuss more about the mentality when you're an agency recruiter. And I think Brian will be able to speak more from the internal talent acquisition side when he's working actually for a company directly. Agency recruiter, I don't want to jump too much into it because I'm sure we'll want to cover these with some questions, but more so our goal is representing a pool of clients and representing a pool of candidates, whereas Brian could cover what internal talent acquisition's working for.
Okay.
And as a corporate recruiter or an internal recruiter, the role typically is talent acquisition, and it's more about reviewing applicants as they come in and matching those applicants or candidates to the requirements of the role that needs to be filled. And so those applicants, they come in through the ATS or Applicant Tracking System, and the internal recruiter is really, thumbs up or thumbs down, typically based on keyword matching that resume. So I think it's very important when you're applying directly to a company as an applicant to make sure that your resume matches the job that you're applying to.
Oh, okay.
And maybe I opened up a can of worms there, but
no. A very important point. And you gave an answer already, but I'll ask the question. Why is it important for an applicant to know the difference? You already gave us some insight, Brian. Greg?
Sure. So I think it's very important for an applicant to know the difference, because the agency recruiter, we're trying to get that candidate as much exposure as possible. Our job and our responsibility is to talk to candidates throughout the day. So we build a rapport with them, we build a relationship, and we know that person beyond paper. Whereas oftentimes, I think the corporate recruiter or the internal talent acquisition team, as Brian said, it's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. When they see the candidate come through, it's a lot of times artificial intelligence that's maybe giving a percentage score of what that resume is to a match. And it's really up to that internal recruiter, maybe give a thumbs up, thumbs down, or maybe have a quick screening conversation. The agency side, we're speaking to that candidate. We're trying to find if maybe something's not on their resume, maybe they forgot to put something, maybe they're not familiar with the process, or maybe they're not right for that one job that we may be responsible for, but maybe one of our colleagues have something that they could be good for. So.
Okay, so we've heard about the applicant tracking system. Brian, give us a little bit more insight into how important that is in your role.
The applicant tracking system from a corporate recruiting perspective?
Yes.
Well, I think it is very important because if you're applying directly on a company website, you're applying directly to that role that you think might be a great fit. The internal talent acquisition team may only look at a candidate's resume for 5 or 7 seconds sometimes.
Wow.
So it's really, really important to make sure that your resume is a match and that you're a fit for that role. And that doesn't mean that it's inappropriate to perhaps have a stretch kind of role that you're applying to. But if your resume doesn't say that you're doing the role that you're applying to, the internal team typically screens you out pretty quickly without even a phone call or an email. And I know that that's a big frustration to candidates, but that I think is the reality of what internal talent acquisition often looks like.
Oh, okay. So, Greg, in terms, you've already given some insight. You work more with the client in the sense, excuse me, the applicant, in the sense of maybe this isn't a fit, but you may want to consider this other position, right?
Exactly.
But their resume still needs to be tight. Can you give some more insight into your side of from an ATS perspective?
Sure. I mean, from the ATS system for the agency, that's our lifeline. That's our core system. We're not really using it to intake applications as much as we're using it to store our candidate pool. We're searching through our applicant tracking system. We're knowing different categories to look in for an applicant. And we just have, I think, a lot more exposure and a lot more, I think, knowledge of different types of positions and different things we've seen on paper of where someone might be a fit, even if the resume doesn't say it, and the resume just needs to be updated, or the resume just, maybe that candidate just needs a little advice on how to correctly explain what they do. And that's not, and I want to put out the disclosure, that's not to say that we lie or we make candidates try to seem like a fit for a role that they aren't. What we do is we coach them and try to help highlight the skills that they have for those roles.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question I received. When it comes to submitting an submitting for a position directly to the company, if you submit once, right, and you get denied for that position, can you submit again? Like, is there a limit to how many times you can apply, Brian?
So I think it certainly depends on the organization. It depends on what applicant tracking system the organization uses. But in my experience as an internal recruiter, and even as an agency recruiter, you can see the history of every application that's come in. And so I think it's important as a candidate or as an applicant to find that balance between applying for every opening at the organization and not applying for something that might be a fit.
Okay. We just got some serious, yeah, we just got some serious intel. Greg, what about on your side?
Sure. I think that's where I'm in agreement on the corporate recruiting side too. Once you apply once to an agency, we have your information, we have your resume. It doesn't hurt to apply for roles that, you know, maybe sometimes we miss it. Maybe sometimes we're just not fast enough to find the resume yet in the database. Most likely we will find that person if we have their information. You know, I think a big difference between agency versus corporate is we're also big into the passive candidates. We're finding those candidates that are not actively applying. We're finding those candidates that are not actively putting themselves out there that they're looking for a job. Whereas I think on the corporate side, and Brian could correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's more of applicant recruiting, application recruiting, than it is passive recruiting and following different, I think, techniques that an agency recruiter can do.
Okay, expand that on that a little bit more, Brian.
So when I've been a corporate recruiter, oftentimes there's even rules, I guess, within the human resources department where they don't want that internal talent acquisition team to be reaching out to candidates. And it's more about reviewing the resumes that come in through the ATS. And then essentially thumbs up or thumbs down on candidates that fit the role.
Okay, so are you both saying, well, let me just say this. So if there's a position that has been advertised by a company, more than likely, you think they'll go with the database that they have as opposed to looking for more applicants?
I think that they'll either look in their internal database or review the applications that come in. They're typically not scouring or sourcing candidates through job boards or LinkedIn or other places.
Yeah,
That's
Greg?
not an absolute, but in my experience.
No, that sounds about right. As a career coach, that sounds about right. Greg?
Sure. I think the big difference is an agency recruiter, their main responsibility is to source candidates. It's to find what's going to create, I hate to put it this way, revenue for that agency. Our biggest asset is our ability to find candidates, to source candidates, and to have a great candidate pool. Whereas I think on the corporate side, their responsibility as talent acquisition is just to fill that role that they have and fill the gaps in the company. Our goal is to get that candidate out there, to find, the phenomenal candidates that maybe are being missed by the internal talent acquisition teams. Maybe this candidate's not applying. Maybe this candidate doesn't know about the job board somewhere, or maybe they did apply and they uploaded, in the past, an old resume. They've uploaded something that maybe they're not good at writing a resume. I can't write a resume for myself. I could help people write resumes all the time. One time I had to do it, I couldn't do it. So there's a lot of variables that go into it, but agencies have the time to spend with a candidate.
Okay, so we've got 4 minutes left. Let's talk about more of the important differences that we want to highlight. And for our listeners and viewers, this is part 1 of 2, right? And I'll go into, yes, Brian, we're going to have you come back to talk about other aspects, which I'll mention in a minute. But what other differences should applicants know before they press or click submit?
Sure. You want to take that first, Brian?
Yeah, Brian, what are your thoughts?
Sure. I think, what I see watching LinkedIn is a lot of applicant frustration of never hearing back when they submit an application. And I think that from a corporate recruiting perspective, sometimes those emails don't get sent out, but I think that an expectation of receiving a phone call for every position that you apply to is unrealistic, particularly when you're applying directly to a company, because sometimes there's 100, 200 applications or resumes that come through for that role. Sometimes there's not, but I think you have to understand how you're applying to a position. And, I always try on the agency side to manage those expectations better, but it's tough on the corporate side.
Do they even get looked at?
And this might be a whole other podcast or a whole other episode, but there's a myth of beating the ATS. I don't know that necessarily exists, but in my experience as a as a corporate recruiter, have at least viewed every resume that comes in, but sometimes it's just a flat, quick, not a fit, no. Screening out as opposed to screening in, I guess.
Okay, Greg?
Sure. I mean, I think on the agency side, to Brian's point, our goal is to please the candidate pool. Our goal is to make them understand that they are appreciated and that they are valuable to us. So we do put in a lot of tools to communicate with them. We do try to acknowledge as many people as possible. To the point of 300 applications coming in, can we call every single one of them? No, I mean, it's virtually impossible sometimes, especially when you split it out, but we do acknowledge it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a phone, an email, a text message, and just constant communication. We try to update on everything that's going on throughout the process. We try to let them know if they're suitable for the role, if they're not suitable for the role. And that's done with a lot of core automations that we have in our systems. And again, that all depends on the person sitting on the other side of the desk, that they're also doing their job to actually look at the resume, give it the thumbs up, give it the thumbs down, and make sure that's again triggered to receive some type of correspondence from us.
Okay, well, with 1 minute left, any other differences that we should mention here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from this is for the agency recruiter. That agency recruiter is trying to maximize the amount of chances that applicant has for a job. They're looking for ways to help create more exposure for that candidate. All their eggs aren't in one basket. It's not with just one company. Whereas I think an agency, corporate recruiter is only focused in on the one company that they're recruiting for, their own company that they're working for. Whereas the agency, we have multiple clients. We have, we have active clients and we have passive clients. I have plenty of clients that are opportunistic hires, that if you send them a good skill profile, they may say, hey, we may have a role for that person. I would love to have a further conversation.
Brian?
Just speaking from an agency perspective, for a job seeker, I think it's smart to have a good agency recruiter in your network. It doesn't mean that he or she may be able to pull jobs out of the sky for you, but they're fighting for you more often to get a job, as opposed to a corporate recruiter who's tied to more rules and regulations within their organization.
Okay.
I think that's the biggest point that Brian just said. I think that's probably one of the best things. We're going to bat for that candidate. We have the stake in the game with them too. We're trying to please the client, and if we truly feel someone could be a fit for that role, we want to make sure that that's getting communicated.
Okay. So with that, part 2, we're going to cover myths, success stories, and since we mentioned it today, we're going to talk about your thoughts on job boards. Yeah, this is going to get juicy and hairy. So, but this is great. This is great. This is a really good forum to talk about this and to share information. Brian, thanks for calling in an hour early. We appreciate you. Really appreciate you. We look forward to having you on next week. Greg, thank you for your frank feedback. Both of you are fantastic. Thank you, dear watchers. Thank you, dear listeners. Until next week.